Hi, I'm Michael Hansen, Senior Fellow here at Brookings and the Director of the Brown Center on Education Policy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event on the future of free college. This event is being recorded and broadcast simultaneously on the web. I welcome those viewing remotely. And for those either in our live audience or on our remote audience who would like to take part in today's Twitter conversation, we invite you to please use #FreeCollege. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, is convinced of the value of post-secondary education. It benefits individuals, families, and societies in a number of ways. Succeeding in the 21st century labor market is increasingly reliant on some level of college education. And the number of students enrolled in institutions of higher education here in the U.S. continues to grow year by year. Yet the topic of today's event is not the value of college, but rather it questions whether college should be made available to a broad swath of Americans at no cost. Now is a great time for this discussion. Going to college is now more expensive than ever. Published college tuition and fees over the last 3 decades, even after accounting for inflation, are up more than 100% across all types of institutions. Consequently, students are leaving more indebted than ever before. Total student loan balances carried by students just surpassed $1.5 trillion earlier this year. Free college programs, often referred to as promise programs, are programs offered by communities or states to eligible students to help offset the rising costs of college to students, and in many cases makes going to college free. These programs have been endorsed and embraced in both red states and blue states, and have been prominently endorsed by a number of politicians. These programs are thriving and, at the same time, evolving. What started with the Kalamazoo Promise over a decade ago has turned into a larger movement that now counts more than 200 programs across 41 states. Yet the promise at the heart of these promise programs has evolved as these programs have spread into different locales. And evolution will likely continue as we contemplate the future of these free college programs here in America. Today's event brings together a distinguished panel of scholars and education leaders to discuss the state of free college in America and where it may be heading in the future. First, we'll hear from Doug Harris. Doug is a professor of economics at Tulane University and is the founding director of the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans. Doug is also a non-resident senior fellow here in the Brown Center on Education Policy. Doug has recently completed an evaluation of a Promise Scholarship Program in Milwaukee. The results of that evaluation were just published today on the Brookings website, and the executive summary was made available for you as you entered the door, and we're happy to have Doug here tell us about what he found. Following Doug's presentation, we will move to our panel discussion, and I will introduce all of the panel participants at that point. Doug, the time is yours.
All right, thanks, Mike, and thanks to Brookings for having this event, and thanks for all of you for being here. I think the free college movement, I think it is a movement now, is a significant one. This is a good time to have this conversation. In my mind, this is one of the most potentially impactful policy changes, if this keeps going, that we've seen in several decades in terms of social and economic policy generally. So this is a really important conversation and potential shift given what's happening in higher education. So I'd say we're at the stage of this now where there's enough traction to have conversation about the details and how these things are going to be designed. So for a while it was this sort of general concept, general idea, free college, and people had and can and do have different ideas about what that means. But I think now we need to start thinking out, well, what could this look like? How might we do this? And what are both the potential promises of this and what can go right, and what are the potential pitfalls if we got it wrong in terms of how we did this? So I think that's really what the hope is, I think, for this event, is to think about the how and why we are doing this. So I'm really glad to present these results. We've been working on this project for 10 years. I've never worked on a project for 10 years before. But when you study college access, that's sort of the nature of the game, right? You start trying to help kids when they're in high school, in this case, 9th graders. It just takes a long time to figure out whether that worked for college. And so we're glad that we were able to make that happen. So a lot of people that I want to thank here. I want to start with the funders. So there's actually a rule that I can't put the funders up on the slides here. So, but I do want to thank them verbally. So the research on this was funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences, and the program itself was funded by the Great Lakes Higher Education Corporation and Associates. So very generous donations on both of their parts to make this happen. I also especially want to thank my research team, if you can stand. So a lot of people have been involved in this over the years. I've listed everybody, and many of them are here with us, and many of them have been with this project since the beginning for the whole 10 years. So it's been a lot of dedication and effort, and I greatly appreciate your time on this. Finally, I want to thank Milwaukee Public Schools. This is where we carried out the project. So many dozens of people have been actively involved in this over many years, and I'm the messenger in a sense. So as Mike said, there are several things going on in the world with higher education that motivate this. I think one is, as Mike said, the rise of loan debt and the perception of unaffordability of college, a growing perception of that. Second is the global decline in the U.S. ranking on college attainment. So we've come back up a little bit in the past several years, but we're still around 10th or so in college attainment, and I think wide recognition that we need to be at least keeping up, if not doing better on that, for long-term social and economic progress. And finally, the inequities in college access by income and race are still quite vast in the U.S., and a lot of that is driven by cost. So if we think about all of those problems together, there is actually one possible way you could address all of them at once, and that is to just make college cheaper. And there are a lot of different ways that you could do that. So this is my take on the policy landscape. So there are different ways to make it cheaper, different ways to give students more funding that all overlap, and these are somewhat general concepts. So we have traditional aid programs like the Pell, we have private scholarships. This is the way things were 20 years ago. This was really the main programming that we had available. Promise scholarships then came on the scene, especially with the Kalamazoo Promise, and that's what is certainly growing right now. And then free college being the most recent, just in the last few years, that idea has come up. They're all connected to each other, but they're all a little bit different from each other too, as the Venn diagram shows. So with traditional aid programs, you got to run it through the FAFSA, and we have this big administrative apparatus that students have to go through to get access to funding, and they don't find out about their aid until the last minute, right? Just before they're ready to go to college, that's when they figure out what aid they're eligible for. With promise scholarships and free college, part of the idea is to make the commitments earlier, right? So that students know at a much earlier time, not just before they're going to college, but when they're younger in high school and middle school and elementary school, so that they're getting the message that they can afford college and that college is for them. So I think that's a pretty distinctive shift. But some free college programs still rely on the FAFSA and the administrative apparatus, and so it's not quite to that ideal of having a really clear, simple commitment to students. Some programs are promise scholarships in the sense that they're place-based and they're focused on particular cities and school districts. Some aren't, right? And so the ones that aren't probably are more in the free college category of things. So all these things, they're kind of related to each other, a little bit different, and there are a lot of specific policy decisions that go into figuring out where we are in this map. So some of those questions are these. What's the maximum amount of aid? Is there an expected family contribution? Is the aid early or late? Do we depend on the FAFSA and that whole application process and the aid packaging that goes on at institutions? Is it first dollar? Is it last dollar? Does it cover living expenses? Can we say it's free based on all the combination of those decisions? Can we call it free in some sense? And if so, what kind of free is it? Is it covering just tuition and fees, or is it covering more than that? Other decisions, which students are eligible for it? Are they meeting performance merit requirements? Are there need requirements? Which colleges are eligible? Where can they use the money? Is it place-based in the sense that it only applies to students graduating from particular schools or attending specific colleges? Are there payback provisions if students don't end up graduating or if they end up leaving the state afterwards? These are a lot of questions that go into this. And again, I think the topic and the focus of this event is on how we do this. What's the right way to do it, and what are the implications of different approaches? You'll notice one other thing popped up on the screen there on that last bit, which is debt-free college, which is another common variation on the theme of free college that sort of sits in the middle in between traditional aid programs and what you might call a pure free college program. So with debt-free college, you still have the expected family contribution, and you still have the FAFSA, and you still have the administrative apparatus there, but it's still meant to convey in a simple way that students will be able to afford college in some way. So this is meant to be just a lay of the land, and partly I'm doing this because I want to be able to situate the program that we actually studied. So I'll get to that in a minute. So how exactly might all these programs help? So they're all meant to make college cheaper, and they all do it in somewhat different ways. But how might this help? Well, the most obvious thing is, well, you make it cheaper, then more people will come. You make anything cheaper, and more people will come. So that's the simple way of thinking about it. But I think the message of our finding the findings of our report are that it's more complicated than that. There are actually more mechanisms at play here than just narrowly making it cheaper for students. Some free college and promise programs bypass that financial aid system, and some don't. So that system creates a lot of uncertainty for students, right? It delays their knowledge about how much aid they're going to be eligible for. And it may change next year, right? So they have to go through the whole thing year after year. They don't know. They might know what they got this year. They're not going to know whether that same amount is going to be available for them next year. And so a pure, simple free college program could help bypass all of that, right? That simplicity and certainty that could come with it. A second aspect of this is that promise scholarships and free college make these early commitments, right? So if we make early commitments to students, it could put them on very different trajectories during high school and even before that. It could get them better prepared during high school so that they're more ready to go to college. It could raise their expectations. And that could then change what's going on in high school. So there's this idea of a college-going culture in high schools, and the idea there is about the set of values and expectations and beliefs and activities that go along with that in high schools that may shape students' interest in and ability to go to college and succeed there. So that's another mechanism. That's not just narrowly you made it cheaper for one student. Now you've changed the whole high school environment in ways that could shape their outcomes. So I raised these last 2 points because it's going to turn out, when I present the findings, that these last 2 pieces actually are pretty important to driving the effects. So let's talk about prior research just for a second. So when we look at programs that have been scaled up, and the places now where this has been done for a while, like Kalamazoo, the results are positive. So we see Kalamazoo had a 12 percentage point increase on college enrollment. The Pittsburgh Promise, 5 percentage point effect. Knox achieves 3 to 4 percentage point effect on college enrollment. There was a review of programs done that includes many of these specific ones where you see a 3 to 13 percentage point effect on college enrollment. And if you look at traditional financial aid, that also has a positive effect. So the results are very consistently positive. Again, if you make it cheaper, more will come, and students will be more likely to succeed. Now, there's still the question of cost here, right? We need to be paying attention to that as well. But I think the upshot of this slide is that this does have promise. Promise scholarships have promise, so to speak. All right, so results look positive so far. Let's now move on to what we found. Right? So the program that we studied is called the Degree Project. This is a randomized control trial where we randomly selected half the high schools in Milwaukee, and all the 9th graders back in 2011 got a $12,000 scholarship offer. It was last dollar. Students could use the money at in-state colleges only. That was enough to cover all tuition and fees for a 2-year degree. So that's the sense in which this is a free college program. And it could be used, though, at 4-year colleges, too. So it was enough to cover full tuition and fees at a 2-year college, but not enough to cover, obviously, at a 4-year college. But the money could still be used at a 4-year college if students chose. And the amount of money was the same regardless of the choice of college. There are performance requirements, right? So this is going to be a big part of the story here. So students had to get a 2.5 GPA cumulative and attend class 90% of the time, also cumulative across their high school years. They had to graduate on time with a regular diploma and fill out the FAFSA. So those were the requirements. These are patterned after the Pittsburgh Promise that I mentioned earlier. We designed this as a comprehensive experiment, meaning that it's designed to figure out how and why any effects emerge. So again, that's the theme of this whole conversation, is about the details and what's going on under the surface. So it's not just, did it have this effect? It's, well, how and why? What was really going on? That's what we're trying to get at here. But it was designed to be focused just on that first bullet, right? It's designed to focus on the narrow effect of reducing the price of college for students. All right, so what did we find? I'm going to skip all the methodological details here and give you the bottom line. It's a randomized control trial, so we have good faith that this reflects the effects of the program. We're going to break this up into 3 phases. So we've got the during high school part, because remember, part of the idea is this is an early commitment and we want to get students on a different track during high school so that they're ready for college. Then we have just after high school, the initial college enrollment decisions, and then the longer term effects, college persistence, and eventually employment and so on. So what do we find? So the good news, we found increased motivation for students, increased college expectations. Students took more steps towards college during high school. They participated in more college access programs. They filled out the FAFSA at higher rates. They applied to more colleges as a result of this. And then longer term, when we look at college persistence and college graduation, we are starting to see some small effects, about 1 percentage point on enrollment 2 years after high school graduation, and on graduation from 2-year colleges 3 years after high school graduation. The bad news is we didn't see effects in other places where we expected them to arise. So one was that there were no effects on GPA, there were no effects on high school attendance or on high school graduation, and those were the performance requirements. So that's where we might have expected to see effects. We also didn't see effects at the threshold. So you might most likely have expected a student who had a 2.4 GPA to just get over that threshold to a 2.5. We didn't see that either. So the incentive effect that's supposed to come with performance requirements didn't seem to arise. We also don't see an effect on initial college entry, and we did see a potential shift from 4-year colleges to 2-year colleges, which is interesting because remember, the amount of money was the same no matter which college you chose, but what was different was that at the 2-year college level, it was enough to cover all tuition and fees, and so students could avoid debt. Right? So we think that that's why that pattern emerges. It's a little too early to look at long-term effects. We've started to look at it. We don't see effects on employment, for example, at this point, but it's too early to make a judgment about those outcomes. So the results are mixed. Why not? Why do we see these effects? Why are the results not quite as positive as what we've seen in these other studies that have been done at scale? So we have a few different theories, and some of which we were able to test. So this is what we think we're fairly certain of at this point. One is that the performance requirements kept the vast majority of students from receiving funds. Now, we knew this was likely to happen because we did a bunch of work beforehand, before we even launched the experiment, to see what the GPA was in Milwaukee beforehand. But only 21% of students met the 3 main requirements, right? So 1 in 5 students who were offered the scholarship actually had a chance to receive it if they went on to college. So basically you cut off, if the main benefit here, to the degree the benefit is students getting the money and or having the prospect of money affect their high school behavior, there wasn't much prospect of that, right? Because the vast majority of them were not going to receive the money, and they realized that early on. So I think the performance requirements were a big part of this. Another way of thinking about this is that when we look at the effects, so that what I've shown you so far are the effects of the offer of the scholarship, right? So everybody was offered in 9th grade the opportunity for these funds. When we look at the students who actually got the funds, what a researcher would call a treatment on treated effect, we actually do see pretty substantial effects, right? So the students who got the money benefited from it and were more likely to go to college, stay in college, and so on. But so few students got the money that when we look at all of the students who were offered, it just doesn't show up as an effect because most students didn't get the money. The second main bullet there is that the small scale and temporary design of this meant that it couldn't catalyze change in high schools. So if you think about what would it take to catalyze change in high schools, one, it would take all of the students in the school being motivated to change what they were doing. But this is only one cohort, right? It was just one cohort of 9th graders. So no more than 30% of students in any given school were eligible for this. And it was temporary. So if you think about it from the school's perspective, they might have been inclined to change what they were doing, offer more college access programs and so on. But there wasn't much motivation to change what they were doing because this was just one small group and this was going to go away at the end of the day. All right, so our intent was, let's design this as a demonstration program. Let's find evidence on a small scale and see what we can learn, and then decide whether it might make sense at a large scale. The message here is that for this kind of program, it looks like it's very hard to actually do it on a small scale and really figure out what the effect is. So how do we know that this matters? There are a few different ways. So one is that we looked at the effects by the number of communications students got. So if you think about how these programs would work at scale, it's much more likely that at scale they're going to get a lot of communications. In Kalamazoo, this was on billboards, right? Everybody knew about this, so they got a lot of communication about it. And in our study, when we see students who got more communications, we see bigger effects, right? So that's the first signal that scale mattered. The second is when we just compare our results to those other scaled-up programs that I mentioned earlier, that our effects are smaller than the scaled-up effects. So it's a pretty clear pattern. Even in the Pittsburgh Promise, which had almost exactly the same requirements, got a substantial positive effect, but we didn't, right? So that's another signal that the scale of the study mattered. So a couple other explanations for what may have gone wrong or tamped down the effects, so to speak. One is that it lacked additional supports for students. So part of it was we didn't get this catalyzing effect on high schools. But some programs also offer additional supports like mentoring and tutoring and so on to students to help them meet those requirements. And that didn't happen. Part of this was about context. So in Milwaukee, the ratio of counselors to students is about 350 to 1. Which is above what's recommended by a lot from professional associations, and also above the state average. So there was not a lot of counselor support in these high schools to help them meet the requirements. So again, this was designed to identify the narrow effect of aid, and so additional supports were not provided, and the context wasn't such that those supports could be naturally provided by the schools. Another final piece that I think we have less evidence on, but it's worth pointing out, is that there were issues resulting from the aid structure, right? That same old aid structure that makes the commitments to students come late and is complicated and burdensome for students. We see that happening here as well, that students didn't end up getting the money until October, November of the first semester in college, right? So that might be why we don't see an initial effect on college entry. Whereas if we had just said it's free from the beginning, then they may have been less worried about that, and it might have had a bigger effect. All right, so what does all this mean? What do we take away? So I think the first thing is probably want to avoid performance requirements. So in addition to everything else I said, a few other remarks on this. One is, we know that performance requirements are going to tend to direct the aid towards students who already have a pretty high probability of college and who have higher family incomes, right? So the performance requirements are going to indirectly target students to more affluent students and likely have a smaller effect on college attendance. Another way to think about this is through the eyes of those who might advocate for performance requirements. So one motivation would be, well, let's have performance requirements so that we can motivate students to work harder during high school, get them better prepared for college, and then have a positive effect that way. Okay, well, in theory, that could work, but we don't see any evidence of that. Remember, we didn't even get students who were at a 2.4 to go to a 2.5. So we don't see evidence that it's going to move the needle on factors that are strong predictors of college success. A second possible motivation, and one that came up in the conversations about designing this, is that if you have the performance requirements, you're going to target the money to students who are most likely to succeed in college and therefore prevent students from dropping out with debt, right? So nobody wants to induce students to drop out with debt. Sounds logical at first, but think about it this way. First of all, we know from the prior evidence that if you give students more aid, they're more likely to graduate, right? So giving more aid is going to increase the probability of graduation, not decrease it. And also the aid itself, of course, is going to reduce the amount of debt that students have to take out, right? So that means under almost any plausible scenario based on our evidence that you're going to, if you're going to put the performance requirements in, you may decrease the number dropping out with debt slightly, but you're going to also decrease the number graduating, period, right? And so put differently, with performance requirements, you're going to decrease the number of graduates more than you're going to decrease the number of dropouts with debt, right? So there's a big loss there in the process. Second recommendation is to try to use free college and other aid programs to catalyze change in high schools. I think we didn't see that in our case, and we think we know why we didn't see that. But I think what this suggests is that mechanism matters. It's not just this, for this student, this is cheaper, and that's going to make them more likely to go to and succeed in college. It's that we can potentially change the culture of high schools in ways that makes students better prepared, and we should be thinking about it as part of that broader mechanism. So just to wrap up and move on to the panel conversation. So again, prior research, when we look at scaled up programs, the results are consistently positive and substantial and convincing. So I believe those results. The effects in this experiment are more modest, and we think we know why. It's because of how it was designed and implemented. But this study is really only designed to understand how then to design these programs. It's not telling us whether it's a good idea or not. It's telling us, well, what's the best way to do it. And that's a common theme in education research in higher education and K-12, that the specific design and implementation of free college and promise scholarships are going to matter as much as whether you pursue that strategy or not. And so there are a lot of decisions to make. I had that whole long list of policy decisions that have to be made. Those decisions are going to matter a lot to how we do this. And so with that, why don't we have a broader conversation and bring up the panel and see what other progress we can make on the policy conversation. So thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.